Okay, now let's look at the different measures here that we have for standard of living and also the strength of a country. First, we have area in square kilometers. Now, is this a great measure for standard of living? The answer is no. It doesn't tell you anything about the standard of living, but it could tell you something about the strength of a country given the space that it has. Now, it's not to say that the larger a country size-wise, the better off it is, because that's not the case at all, but it can tell you something about how powerful it could be theoretically, because when you see the size of a very small country like Luxembourg, you know that it's not going to have a lot of the other features that some countries will. Next we have population. Population is going to tell you the total number of people that are living in the country at the time. This can go from very low to very high. We have the Pitcairn Islands at 48, and this is going back a couple of years here to, I believe it's 2011 or 2012. And then we have a country that exceeds more than 1.3 billion people, 1,343,000,000 people. So that tells you a lot about how many people are there, and it's going to have an influence on a lot of different things that we'll come to later on. Population growth rate. This is going to tell us whether the population is increasing or decreasing in a country and by how much. This can be really important to tell us where the country is going to be headed in a few years, because if the growth rate is very low, let's say the growth rate is less than 0.5%, then you know that you're not going to have quite as many people being born into the country, and going down the line, let's say another 50 years from now, you're not going to expect the population to have grown as much as in a country in which the population growth rate is somewhere in the range of 10%, which would be extremely high and unrealistic. Nonetheless, population growth rate. Infant mortality rate. This one is very tricky, and it's also one of the most important ones. Now, infant mortality rate is going to tell us this exact number. How many deaths there are for every 1,000 live births prior to the children reaching the age of 2. I'll restate that here one more time. How many children die prior to reaching the age of 2 per every 1,000 live births? That's a little bit better definition there. So it's going to be per 1,000 births. There's my wonderful 1,000. So out of every 1,000 live births, how many children do not reach the age of 2? Now, the higher this number is, that's going to tell us that there are some issues that exist in this country, and it doesn't tell us exactly what the problem is, but it can really be related to a handful of different things. Included in this would be the healthcare of a country. If the healthcare is very poor, there's a good chance that the infant mortality rate was going to be a little bit higher. Now, what do we see these numbers ranging from? You will see them low in terms of maybe 6 per 1,000 would be around where America is, and some get down to as low as less than 2.5 per every 1,000. And then in some countries you'll see this actually as high as 170 some, being Afghanistan, which has the highest from previous years in the world. So infant mortality rate can tell us a lot. Healthcare, it can tell us a little bit about education, because it might tell you that people are a little bit less educated in how to care for a baby. And a lot of other factors as well. Infant mortality rate, one of the best measures that we do. Next we have life expectancy. Life expectancy is going to tell us the average age of death that we should expect for a typical person in a country. This is important because it's going to tell us about healthcare and some other things as well. Interestingly enough, life expectancy differs depending on gender between male and female. Life expectancy is a very solid measure as well. Literacy rate, as the definition shows us over here, it is the definition being age 15 and over can read and write. And what percentage of the population can. The only thing that's tricky about literacy rate is that for many of these countries, they don't report their literacy rates very accurately, and they can make up the numbers. So that's something to be a little bit cautious of with literacy rate. Next, number of years of education. How many years on average does a child get in terms of education? So when we look over here, and this is saying the United States, and this is from 2008 with the female number, it says 17 years. That means that the average child is doing 13 years of education prior to going to college. If you think about it logically, kindergarten, then 1 through 12, there's our 13 years, and then you can add in on average 5 years of education there. For males, that is an average of 2 years beyond high school education. Next we have GDP. The wording here is gross domestic product. It sounds a little bit tricky, but it is not too difficult. So here's what it means. GDP is the total amount of business produced in a country in a year. There's an actual formula you can use I'm not going to get into. I just want you to be thinking how much business production exists in a country annually, so annually being yearly. This is going to tell us about how powerful the economy is, though. So this is really an economic rating. Now, to make this a little bit better and to make it connect more to how many people live in your country, what many people consider to be the best measure of the strength of a country is the GDP per capita being divided by the workforce. So this is going to say, okay, on average, what does the typical worker produce in a country in a year? This is going to tell us how effective people are in a country and how strong their economy is in general. Because while it is not directly related to pay and to salary, it is going to have implications that are going to connect to that. Kind of connecting GDP there, I mentioned labor force, how many people are working in a country is what we divide the GDP by. Labor force is how many people work in a country. How many people do we have? This is important because this tells us how many workers we have available. It's not the same as population because there are many people that don't work and they choose not to work or that are too young or old to work. So think about it from that perspective as well. Next, we have unemployment rate. Unemployment is a very, very, very important statistic. The goal for a country is to have a very low unemployment rate. Unemployment means that you cannot find a job, but you want one. That's the key here. People who choose not to work do not count into the unemployment rate. So if we say that we have a 10% unemployment rate, that means 1 out of every 10 workers who wants a job can't find a job in the field that they're looking for one. That's unemployment rate. Very, very important. And think about this. Unemployment is a double negative for a country because if somebody is not employed, that means they're not making money, which means they are not paying taxes. And then on top of that, in many cases, these people are requiring some sort of welfare benefit, which means that they're actually taking tax money to help themselves. So if you look at it, they're not paying taxes and they're actually getting paid with tax money. That's not what a country wants. A country wants unemployment to be as low as possible. Now, not all countries do have welfare programs like we do in America, but if you're looking at most of the civilized countries, they do to some extent. Next, we have population in poverty. The poverty threshold or poverty line, as defined over here on the left, is the minimum level of income deemed adequate in a given country. This is really tricky because in America, the poverty line is far higher than it is in some other countries. Like if you look at what it's like in a very poor country, they're going to tell you that a person only needs to make somewhere in the range of $1,000 a year maybe in order to be above the poverty line, whereas in America it's much higher. It's in the 20s, $20-some thousand per year. Nonetheless, it's basically saying, do you have enough money that you can provide for yourself what you need or not? And if you don't, they would consider you to be somebody who's living in poverty. Next, we have public debt as a percent of the GDP. What this tells you is how much is your country borrowing in comparison to how much it is actually making. This is an important factor in determining whether a country's economy is truly really strong or if they are doing well to some extent, but they still have a lot of issues in terms of debt. Internet users tells us how many people have access to the internet in a country. This can be an important rating because it tells us do people have access to technology overall. Next, number of soldiers on active and reserve. How many people in the country are ready to go should a war start today? Next, how many males do we have fit for military? In other words, do we have people who are ready to go if we needed to instate a draft and force people into war? Would we be able to have enough? Well, that's going to tell us something there. Next, number of citizens in prison. They say that a country, you can tell how good a country is by how it treats its lowliest people. Well, that would be the amount of people that we have who are in prison and who have committed crimes. So we want this to be low, theoretically. Nonetheless, it's not a rate, though. So if you have a really, really large population in your country, this is going to be a tricky measure because it's not going to be related to how many people there are. It's just going to tell you in total how many people are in prison. And lastly, we have homicide rate per 100,000 people. Anything that's a rate is a better measure here, just so you know that, because it compares it to how many people are in the country, which makes it easy to compare countries with large populations and those with small populations. The homicide rate is going to tell you how many people are killed, murdered, per 100,000 people in a country in a year. You obviously want this to be low. So now that we have all of these statistics defined here, you need to look at them and determine to yourself which ones you think are the most important and how they influence people. Okay? Good luck with the rest of the assignment.